and I want you to push back on this as well. On the meta side is the following. If we are going that direction, there's nothing you can do about it on the meta side to change it. We can't change that direction. We're going in that direction. It is already too late. A guy pitched a meta world for valuetainment to me 3 years ago, Antonio, who was here with us, and I'm like, what? And then now he came back, and now we're having a real conversation about it. So if we go to that route, this means what?
Sure. Yeah.
This is...
Well, you'll just buy a representation of that in the valuetainment world. You know, you'll have like a gold mine that has little trucks moving.
But
and
that becomes an NFT.
They're selling digital real estate now. There's digital land that doesn't exist.
Someone just bought a multi-million-dollar yacht on a metaverse to hang out on a fake yacht. I'd rather go to a real yacht in South Beach.
Will there ever be a time where maybe you're taking the mushroom trip to have a human experience and you say, wait a minute, like I had a thought and my social credit score went down, and now I don't have access to the valuetainment metaverse because I'm being punished.
They're trying to.
Will it ever happen? And what will you want?
Insecurity.
When that
They're
happens?
trying to create an environment of insulated insecurity. You're fat on a real yacht. You're not fat on the metaverse yacht. You're short in real life. You're not short in metaverse. You can't dunk in real life, but on NBA 2K, you can dunk. You can 360. So there's this idea that the real world is unfair. So now, going back to your point, these people are able to get control because they're making life fairer for everybody. Give up all my control in the real world because I don't like the real world. I don't like who I am. I don't like the money that I make. I don't like the way that I look juxtaposed against this. I don't like the girlfriend that I have. The metaverse is the world that I want. This is my idealized version of self. So I will give up everything in the real world as long as you keep me safe and as long as I can have access to my idealized world.
Let me go somewhere with that.
So the ones that suck are the most bitter.
Right.
And the most shit. And but it's, again, the same thing. It's like so many of them, they really have mediocre work. And they don't like the fact that it's not being recognized and respected, that people don't come out to see them in the clubs. And
they can't see it that way.
Well, they don't see it because they think they're great because they're narcissists, right? And so their perspective is anybody that gets way further than them, first of all, they feel bad when they find out that, you know, Kevin Hart's selling out 50,000 seats, or that this person's doing that, or, you know, Sebastian sold out Madison Square Garden 4 nights in a row, and they're just like, and it's unattainable. It's not going to happen to you. It's literally not going to happen. You're 43 years old. Your life is shit. You know, you could barely sell a Thursday night at the Funny Bone in Cleveland. Like, what are you going to do? What the fuck are you going to do? And that feeling is terrible. Does Cleveland even have a Funny Bone?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Columbus. Hilarities.
And
it's
then
not the Funny Bone.
No, yeah. Cleveland, Hilarities.
Yeah.
And,
My point is, they get angry. And so they start coming up with reasons why that person sucks. They suck. They fucking always sucked. And
transphobic, hateful.
Transphobic, fucking homophobic, racist, insensitive to xenophobic and Islamophobic. And but what's really going on is there's a feeling that they get when they see other people succeed that makes them feel terrible.
Mm-hmm.
So they associate that person with a bad feeling. And they hate that person. What they really hate is their own lack of success.
100%.
That's a lot of it.
And then
for comics, at least.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a lot of people, and then the thing about Chappelle is, like, at this point, the special's been out long enough. I don't feel like we're spoiling anything, but the special
that just happened. You guys saw Mark Cuban bought a small city, right?
Yeah.
In Texas. What did he pay for it, by the way?
Like $4 million.
Okay, let me read that real quick, and you'll see where I'm going with this part here.
Mustang, Texas?
Yeah, something like that. He just decided to buy the city. Mark Cuban buys a small town in Texas just because. CNN story. He just bought the entire town of Mustang, Texas, a blip on the map off I-45 with a population of 21 people. The reason Cuban said a buddy needed to sell it, I don't know what if anything I will do with it. Cuban said Mustang is pretty much a 77-acre blank canvas for Cuban. The town was founded in the 1970s, and et cetera, et cetera. There's nothing really crazy about it, right, on why he bought this for $4 million. But here's what I will tell you. To argue my own point I just made, is the following. Here's what I think folks who have money ought to do. I think what would be very interesting is the following. America was kind of founded on being a country that you would come to, that you had to qualify to come here, right? You went through what? The whole the island you would go to.
Rikers.
Ellis
Island, not
Yeah.
Rikers.
What?
I'm thinking of Rikers.
That's
Ellis
That's a
Island.
different group
Too much
of-
mafia states
Yeah,
of
my
America,
bad.
buddy.
Ellis.
You'd go to Ellis Island,
Yep.
and the first question was what? What value do you bring to us?
Yeah.
And you would say, I know how to sew. I know how to do this. I know. And they would say, okay, cool. Come on here.
Yeah.
You're bringing value to America, right? That was the right setup. And then it was what? What value do you bring? Who cares? Come on. You're a criminal? Totally fine, bro. Come on. It's okay. We welcome everybody. It's standards were dropped. It's almost like this IMG, whatever the sports program is, they pay $83,000 per
In
year.
Bradenton, Florida.
Yeah, where you go there and your kid becomes
Sure.
one of the
MG
best tennis
Academy,
players.
yeah.
And they said, you know what, though? You're rich, Pat? Send your kid. It's okay. You're lowering the standard just because of money, right? That's what happened to America. It dropped its standards dramatically. What I would be very interested in is the following. Take some of these guys like who's the guy that made $5 billion on a Roth IRA, Peter Thiel. Take some of these guys who bring their money together and they say, look, let's put $100 billion. Let's buy a small country. And the only people that can come here, you have to qualify. And the standards are so high. And in our Constitution, it states you have to only bring value to come here.
Who is John Galt?
But I think that's the direction it's coming next. If you get to the tipping point that you piss off the creators always have an option. So what I'm saying to you is, I think this whole thing of majority saying, oh my gosh, the government is so good to me. They're giving me so many free things. This is awesome. What a great noble of people. I can just stay home and kick in and just buy Ethereum and Bitcoin and make money and play video games. These guys are the greatest people I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
And they're going to say, oh, really? Really? No problem. You want to do drugs? Did you hear what Elon Musk said yesterday in an interview about drugs? Did you guys hear about this or no? Elon Musk says drugs probably make you age more. If you can go a little bit lower. Tesla Inc. Elon Musk spoke out in opposition to President Joe Biden's economic signature package, questioning the need for legislation that would support electric car adoption due to concerns government. And then he's talking, and then eventually he starts talking about drugs in this interview. So yes, we're going in this direction of, hey, you should try this, try this drug, try that drug, try this drug. I think the creators in the next 5, 10, 15 years, what Mark Cuban did with $4 million, dude, if $100 billion, people say we're buying a country, you want in? It's $10 million buying. No problem, I'm in. I'm fully in. Put $10 million, a minimum $10 million buying to live in this place. Let's go create. And then we go. And then we start building our own country. I think, do not be surprised if in the next 5, 10, 15 years, that takes place.
Pat, it's called Singapore, and it already exists. It was exactly this concept.
Yeah.
And that's where everyone is, by the way. There's been more family offices open there than any other place in the world.
That's your boy. COVID, exactly.
Bloomberg New Economy Forum is, by the way, that's the next iteration of World Economic Forum. That's kind of done. It's the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. It just happened. It was in Singapore. Everybody was there. There's too many jets and not enough hangars. I mean, it's this type of thing is going on.
Yeah.
But
Have you seen what Singapore looks like, by the way? Can
Yeah,
you pull
like
up
it's,
Singapore?
It
the richest place per
used
square
to
foot
be
in the world.
a swamp. Okay, but this is, you're talking about something that's different from, imagine that as a swamp to that, all because of what you're talking about. But in this era, the power is in control of data. I mean, data is what these guys want to control, like Musk. The cars are not the issue here. It's control. It's what can you grab. That's where your power comes from. But we're talking about the underclass. In America, there was no, nowadays, it's like you just walk across the border and get a Social Security number and you're part of the underclass. And elites love a huge underclass. It's kind of like when you go to Mexico City, it's a nice place if you're an elite because you have a big wall around your place and you have guards and you have all these things. And it's not a nice place if you're looking for meritocracy, for a place to rise.
It's feudalism.
It's very difficult. But if you're at the top, nobody is going to come and get you as long as you play your cards right.
Slavery is good for the plantation owner.
Exactly. And so what you're talking about is very complicated because you have this gigantic underclass that's kind of waiting for the sweepstakes with crypto. The next coin that went up to a penny is Pancake Coin, and everybody's like, oh, my friend had it. I should have bought it. I mean, this is distraction, and Metaverse is distraction. But now you're talking about what elites are going to do, and they're not going to advertise that you can come to the compound. I mean, these guys are doing this. It's happening right now. I mean, these guys are not sitting around in Kansas City in a subdivision. I mean, it's a different life.
I will tell you, there is a way to judge somebody that's going to bring that even is not a millionaire, not a billionaire, that's going to bring value to your town. It's very easy to decipher and process through that. It's not that complicated. What are you bringing to the table? We're going away from what are you bringing to the table. So this is a 2-point argument here that the last 15 minutes we went into. We'll change the topic here in a second. One of the arguments is Meta coming? Yes. Is it going away? I don't think so.
No.
You may say it's going away. I don't think it's going away. If it's not going away, this is not going to be the same as it's been the last 20 years, because Meta is a full argument against this. And NFT, Ethereum, Bitcoin, all of that is going to be an argument for why you ought to be there. Because if you want to buy a token, the only way you can buy a token 50% of the time is through Ethereum, right?
Right.
If you want to get in there, if you want to buy an NFT, if you want to do this, I was just at Art Basel conference this last week. You guys went to the Art Basel. You know how it was. So you're walking around and you're looking at
Greensboro, North Carolina.
Well, you crushed it. I mean, some of the guys were sending me messages, but going back to it. So I was at Art Basel, and I'm walking around, I'm looking at these pictures. Okay, some of the stuff was freaking strange. That's art. I love it, right? But I don't know if you saw that. There was like 10 galleries that were selling NFT art, and that's all it was.
Did you talk to Perez? He had comments that went kind of
George Perez.
Yeah, I mean, he got like a lot of heat because he was really upset about this, because he said art is an experience. It's kind of like, I've been out to Marfa, Texas to see the Donald Judd Foundation, and it's really a trip everyone should make. I mean, Jeff Gunlock is the one that told me about visiting there. He's like, you got to visit there. It's this Dan Flavin light exhibits and all these things. You can't see them anywhere else. Yeah. See them anywhere else, okay? Think about what Gunlock told me. You can't see them anywhere else. When you go to the Judd Foundation, no cameras. Not because they don't want you to photograph the art, because Donald Judd said, if you're looking at the aperture of a camera, you're not using your eyes. And the art affects your eyes because you look at the art, you have an experience. And I want you to have that experience here. You can look at your camera some other time. Perez is saying that. He's saying art is an experience.
How old is Perez?
Perez
he's in his 70s.
Not young, but he...
I mean, there you go. That ends the argument.
So here's the thing. Are we transitioning into a time where the experience is you've got a rock with 2 laser eyes and you flex in the metaverse? And if we are, then what we're saying is human beings now are comfortable not having individuality, which probably is true, but will they ever wake up and say, my whole entire life is
a lie.
Captured and gone?
Well, there's 2 different arguments that are being made right here.
Well, do you eventually, most people become grumpy old men, okay?
Slowly we do.
And by the way, and we have to cling on whatever our legacy is. And anything that takes away from our legacy, we kind of become grumpy. So let's just say whatever that legacy. If you're
do you know anything about George Perez? You know what, Pam? It's the Perez Art Museum of Miami. I lived across the street from it. So, like, the guy has a vested interest in typical art.
What I'm trying to say is, if you're going there and the legacy is tied to it, he has to say that.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I don't own a single NFT. Not one. I don't own one of those monkeys, any of that, and I don't own none of that stuff, right?
The Bored Apes.
The apes. I don't know if I may eventually buy one. I'm telling you, as of right now, I don't. All I'm saying to you is, a comment like that being made, goes back to the movie Grumpy Old Man. So
let me say something
nothing
about
against the guy. He's a legend. I get it. But in that market, the argument from NFT is going to be,
Let me say something about what EB said that I want to revisit, and you touch on it with the NFT. So you talked about essentially the Warren Buffett quote about be fearful when people are greedy and be greedy when people are fearful. I was also there a few hours after you. This was, what was it, Sunday?
I was there with my wife and kids. You were there with 4 girlfriends.
Regardless, we were checking out art. It was good. Adrian actually bought a piece. In crypto, our buddy.
A real piece.
But he paid
used
for
digital currency to buy a real piece of art.
Jackpot.
All right.
Yeah. So here's my point. Be fearful when people are greedy. Be greedy. Yeah. So we're there. We're checking out art. It's crazy. It's expensive. We usually, hot tip, you go on Sunday at 7 o'clock when it ends at 8. And they're selling a piece for $5,000.
Save that money.
You go for they're selling a piece for $5,000. You're like, look, it's going to cost you $1,000 to ship it. I'll take it off your hand. I'll give you for $3,200. Bing, 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 bing. So some guy comes up to me and he has this like French accent. He's like, yes, look at this piece. We're selling it as an NFT, and you have to understand that we're showing you the experience. But then when you buy it, so. And I go, yeah, but so what's the NFT? He's like, yes, this is the wave of the future, and you have to understand. And I go, yeah, but what's the NFT? And like.
Maybe Perez owns the building.
We get to the bottom of it finally.
All right,
Yeah.
almost back.
Yeah, I'm buddies with his son, J.P. Perez.
Is that
Pimp.
right?
Total pimp.
So, anyways, you were saying, so the old, the book,
we
the
back?
kid book, yeah, it's
Yeah,
back.
there's a children's book, The Emperor's Clothes, and we all know the story is that they're like, no, you look great. You should spend a lot of your treasure to buy this new fabric, and there is no fabric, and
He's naked.
He's naked,
Yeah.
and he's all embarrassed in the end. And so what we're really saying is, will there ever be a moment when people say, holy crap, I actually need something that I can put my hand on? And the answer so far has been no. So
Not for 1 year or 2 years, for
for a
100 years.
while.
Tesla back in the day was saying that he didn't like the concept of television because people will think they've gone to the Grand Canyon because they've seen the Grand Canyon,
Yeah.
and you haven't really seen the Grand Canyon, and it's, his whole thing was he wanted to transport people there. That's what he
Yeah.
think technology should have been used for, human transport instead of just, he thought it was cheapening. And obviously him and Edison didn't get along, but he thought it was cheap that somebody could take a digital rendering of something, show it to somebody, and then their brain would interpret it as having been there, But we're going to be able to go to the Grand Canyon in the metaverse. We're going to be able to go. Who wants to stand in line in Disney World? You can go into Disney World in the metaverse and not have a line, and then go up and down the roller coaster in the metaverse. And philosophically, I tend to agree with you. I don't like where it's going. I think it's dangerous. I think that giving up personal autonomy for nonstop, serotonin is horrible.
Yeah.
But I don't see.
And why is it horrible? Because now someone can turn it off.
Yeah, it's total control. You've
See, all we're talking about is the upside of it. The smartphone's great. You know where you're going all the time. You can pre-order a coffee and make it any way you want. But someone can turn it off.
No. See, this
You're
is
saying the controller can turn it off.
this is.
But as the user, you can also turn it off and say, I'm going off the grid.
Hold on,
Good
real
luck.
quick. This is
Yeah.
what I think has happened in this conversation. This is what we're having two different conversations at the same time. We're having a conversation about where this thing is going, and then you're having a conversation about why it's wrong to go that way. I don't disagree with you, but we're talking about trying to speculate. We're talking about tangible and real.
You can do both. I really believe you can do both. That's why I talk about the platform of the crypto and then the coins. If you understand the platform and you understand the coins and you want to make a play into it, knowing that, you can do both. You can do both.
But you're not doing both. But you're not doing both.
I've kind of got all that I need.
You're all in on gold.
Yeah, it's not. I'm not all in on gold. I have the carbon credit royalty business is incredible. You're planting mangrove trees, in Southeast Asia and selling the carbon capture to people that fly in airplanes.
Okay, but like right there though.
Crazy.
So but you're doing carbon credits.
Yeah.
Carbon credits is basically a tax for living.
It's an existence tax.
It's just so everything
Yeah.
is carbon. So how can you're worried about the morality of one thing, and then the other thing is
I'm not worried about the morality. Like I think you can play a trend, and then you can do something with your own money.
I
at
don't
the
think
same
there's
time.
anything more evil, and I know that all the environmentalists and the lefts and they think I'm a crazy righty and all that other stuff. There's nothing more evil in the world to me than a carbon tax.
Yeah.
Who the hell gets to tax you for living?
It's crazy, and people are all for it. Take a poll of young people, and they say that's important. People are more interested in that business, by the way, than the Metallo. Metallo business, you tell someone about 30 years of gold, no, I'm not interested. 30 years of mangrove trees, I'm all in. I want that. When can I buy that on Robinhood? I'm ready right now. It's amazing. Investment bankers, we'll do a roadshow for that. We're going public next fall. They'll set up 2 weeks of meetings. In the gold business, 1 day.
I don't know. I'm not. You will never put me in the box of a crypto guy. Would you ever put me? You've been with me for how many?
No,
I'm not a crypto guy, and I'm not a gold guy.
What the fourth industrial revolution will lead to is a fusion of our physical, our digital, and our biological identities.
The difference of this fourth industrial revolution is it doesn't change what you are doing. It changes you. If you take a genetic editing, just as an example, it's you who are changed. And of course, this has a big impact on your identity.
It is important to use the COVID-19 crisis as a timely opportunity. So people assume we are just going back to the good old world which we had, and everything will be normal again in how we are used to normal, in the old fashion. This is, let's say, fiction. It will not happen. The cut which we have now is much too strong in order not to leave traces.
Pretty nice prosthetic, and I've been looking into brain-computer interfaces since I lost the hand, because that's going to be the next step of the prosthetic hand, essentially. So recently, I had what's called a spinal cord stimulator installed. So what they do is they take a little box that's got a battery in it, and they place it in my lower back. And then they run wires up my spinal cord or up the spinal column into the spinal cord, and then up into my neck. So then they can create a current, and then they can direct the current down into an area where you're in pain. So for me, it's down in my left hand. So they're taking a current, pushing it down into my left hand, and it's canceling out the pain to some degree, right? So the next step of that is Neuralink. They need to go into the brain for that. They've been going into the spine for a long time. It's easier down there. They know where to place things. They know if they place it here, it's going to hit you in the leg. If they place it here, it's going to hit you in your back. Here, it's going to be your arm. So they're pretty good at this thing. So the next step is the brain. And as we talked about last time, DARPA has been the go-to on this for about 20 years. They've done a lot of proof of concept projects that have shown that, like, a quadriplegic woman can operate a arm independent of herself with just her brain. She used it to feed herself, all kinds of cool stuff. They even plugged her into a flight simulator just to see what she could do. You know, they've got all the money and they've got all the toys.
That's pretty amazing. And, you know, here's the whole thing, dude. It's like when we start saying DARPA, we start talking about all this stuff, there's some dark energy with that, right? Because we think of all stuff. But, you know, as I listen to you, I'm like, there's a lot of wonderful applications to this that help people like you and this woman that you're talking about, that I think many of us will, I don't know anybody would be like, dude, this is great. I think this is awesome. I think someone, you know, messing up their spine and being a paraplegic is such an incredibly hard thing to go through in life. And if you could help these people in a weird way that helps them bypass their spinal damage, and they're able to go back, you know, and we're in the early stage of this, go back to some sort of mobility and being able to get as close as they can to what they had before their accident, I think everybody would be really, really behind that. You know, I even think the most, you know, hardened conspiracy theorists would be like, yeah, man, that would be great if we could do that. But then it's like, what are the negative outcomes possibly? Like, what is the dark side of almost everything that DARPA does, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of dark. And I mean, like you're saying with the spinal cord thing, I can actually tell you how they're going to do this. So what they're going to do is they're going to take somebody that's got a spinal cord injury. They've got a bunch of damaged nerves down in their back. But every once in a while, especially if you get it quick, there's going to be some nerves that kind of go dormant and they just can't carry the load of the whole deal. So what they're going to do is they're going to chip you right away. As soon as you get hurt, they're going to fit you for a prosthetic that goes over your entire body. Maybe you're just your legs if you're only experiencing leg problems. And they're going to wire that up to the brain, and they're going to make those legs operate like they're your legs. Then they're going to stick a VR helmet on you. And so when you look down, you're going to see your legs. You're not going to see a robot. And after a little bit, you're going to start walking again, and it's going to train your body to repurpose those nerves. Those nerves are going to light back up, and pretty soon you're going to be walking again. And, you know, Elon Musk in his last press release said that he knows that he can do this. So, you know, they put out the video talking about dark stuff. They put out the video of the chimp playing a video game with the Neuralink. I don't know if you saw that.
But I've heard
okay, so there's a chimp playing Pong with his Neuralink. And you know, everybody looks at that and go, oh, how cute. Look at what the monkey can do, you know? But when he says, I know we can do this with spinal cords and we know they're working on monkeys, the dark part is they're probably got a bunch of monkeys back there that they're severing their spinal cords, chipping them, and then trying to teach them to walk again. So, you know, people like this, they don't usually look at injuring animals as a
that is it. That is the dark side. And you know, you talk to some people and they're like, well, you know, it's better that it's animals than people. I don't know about that, but you know, I don't know how you study the effects of certain things. You know, you got to break some omelets. You got to break some eggs to make an omelet, but I don't know if the pain and suffering, like all the stuff that you're hearing about that Fauci did, I think it's like really disgusting.
Yeah.
Politicians are blackmailed. And it doesn't have to be sex crimes anymore. It can just be like, oh, got your emails because the email servers are being run by this company, blah, blah, blah. Even companies like Palantir have ties to the Maxwell sisters. So
they're also obviously a bunch of hypocrites, which is a good way to segue into the hypocritical discussion of the Omicron point, because I think that this is obvious today. There's a lot of hypocrisy everywhere in this conversation around COVID-19, but pretty much everywhere in politics and media and everything else we talk about. But you recently had a podcast where you discussed the conversation of Omicron, the vaccine equity conversation, and why that reveals some pretty hypocritical stances today that I think are, you know, in my opinion, people that are afraid to stand up for something, or rather just being driven politically by something that they think is the right thing to do. You know, so give me your thoughts and lay this out for people.
Okay, yeah. So I recorded a podcast. It's not out yet. It'll be out tomorrow, and I really encourage people to go and listen to it. I recorded it with Jeremy Lafredo, who's a contributor to my site and also to the Gray Zone. And basically what we talked about, well, several things, but one of the main things was the vaccine and equity argument that I'm sure a lot of people have seen from left-leaning progressive sites. Common Dreams, Jacobin, Democracy Now!, things like that, and also a lot of, I guess, analysts or independent, self-identified independent journalists that have sort of made the same claim as well. And it's sort of been the safe criticism of Big Pharma during this period that, oh, you're depriving the global south of vaccines for profit motives. That's the only profit motive they'll acknowledge often, failing to notice perhaps the booster dose offers much more in terms of a profit motive for these companies, and, you know, the controversies within the FDA and the CDC, which are heavily compromised anyway. But them disagreeing with the booster dose and it being forced through anyway to the benefit of Big Pharma, you know, that whole discussion isn't really there, or any other instance of corruption here, really even criticism of the military's heavy involvement in the COVID-19 vaccination campaign, right? It's sort of been solely focused on Big Pharma is bad because they only care about profits for the vaccines in the developing world, and they're depriving the global south of these great and wonderful vaccines. And if only we could increase the supply of these great and wonderful vaccines to the global south, then everyone in the global south would take them, right? So that's sort of what the argument is, but it's that may have worked last year and before the vaccine rollout and before vaccines actually made it to the most under-vaccinated continent, Africa. But now that they're arriving, there's been a dramatic shift in narrative, and it really merits looking at, because it's, you know, a lot of these people that have supported this notion identify as anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist. So it's really important to revisit this. So let me share a couple, mainstream media stories here. So starting off, I'm sure you've covered this, Ryan, but this is from the New York Times. Africa, far behind on vaccines. Every other continent is ahead. This is from December 1st, not that long ago. But it says, just days before scientists discovered Omicron, South Africa's government had asked Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer not to make some planned deliveries of their COVID-19 vaccines. This was not, stands kind of in contrast to the claim that it's all about vaccine equity. The reason they were sending them back, as you can see here, vaccine skepticism. There is a fair amount of apathy and hesitancy. And as I'm sure you've discussed extensively, Ryan, there was an Associated Press article not that long ago where scientists and academics are baffled at why Africa basically doesn't have a COVID problem.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's an important point right there, because how exactly can they be struggling? Like, their argument is that we need to get it to them because they're all struggling. But before the hype about Omicron, which is already showing not to be a problem even for South Africa and Botswana, they weren't having a problem. So none of this hits home. You know what I mean? Like, they're missing every swing they're making on this, but it still goes forward. It's amazing.
Right. So basically, what the argument is now, and you can see this from a couple days ago, this is from CBC state-funded Canada News. It's not vaccine equity anymore. Yeah. It's one part health system capacity and another part hesitancy. Yeah. And they note some things down here. 40% of the vaccines that have arrived in Africa have not been used. That's according to Tony Blair's think tank. Okay. So Namibia,
shifting the narrative from that because of greedy Western countries, they're not getting it, to now that the country itself doesn't want it. That's the point, right?
Well, yeah, it's not. They can't argue it's vaccine inequity anymore because the people there don't want to take it.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
they're voluntarily declining to take it. So this claim that this is vaccine apartheid, as some people have been calling it, and all of that really doesn't stack up with the data anymore. As you can see here, Namibia had to destroy over 100,000 expired doses because those who are eligible are refusing to be vaccinated. And basically, you have also 3 in 4 health workers unvaccinated in Africa due to concerns over vaccine safety and adverse side effects.
Wow.
And so, this is pretty significant. Okay. And you have, this is a big shift here, because for a long time it was, we just have to get the vaccines there and then they'll take it and everything will be fine. Well, now, these same people making these arguments, some of them anyway, not necessarily in progressive media, but where these ideas tend to come from and then percolate down to those other people, they are making a very dramatic and troubling shift. I'll get to that in a second, but this is another article after Omicron as well, talking about the lack of vaccinations, vaccine hesitancy. Less than 50% in Ethiopia will take the COVID-19 vaccine. Only 7% of Africa's population has been fully vaccinated. And they keep mentioning now that a lot of it has to do with vaccine hesitancy. And now that after Omicron, there's discussions of introducing mandates to make it involuntary now.
And this is the point that, for those that watched my show last night, it's staggering that they're still making this argument. Fauci himself has already stood up and said Omicron is not more dangerous. Every aspect of the data from Botswana, from South Africa, even the WHO has called it and directly quoted saying super mild. And yet here they are still going, but Omicron, therefore we need to force it now. Like, they're not connecting with their own narrative anymore. This is falling apart in front of us.
Yeah, well, Omicron is 0 deaths.
Right.
Officially.
0. And it's been transmitted by only vaccinated people as far as everything I can find. It started with 4 and has spread continually by more vaccinated people. Every single story you can find.
Yep. Well, Chile's health minister said Omicron is going to hunt down and infect and kill the unvaccinated in spite of all of that evidence. He's a little shit. He's actually very little. I call him a nano Paris. His name is Enrique Paris. Nano in Spanish means like dwarf. He's a little man, a little angry man. Anyway, so well, it's just really frustrating to see that guy go on TV and lie every day and say all this awful fear-mongering shit that's like provably lies, and like
Right.
you couldn't even get away with in the US or the UK saying the shit he says, and nothing happens to him here, and it drives me wild. Anyway, this is an article from Politico, right, about Omicron, how it has raised concerns about global vaccine equity and now hesitancy, because now they've had to admit that now that all that the vaccine inequity issue, they can't use that anymore to explain why the vaccination rate remains low. They have to acknowledge the vaccine hesitancy, as they call it, angle there. That now there's concerns about global vaccine equity and hesitancy, but really it's focused on Africa. Now there's global concern, they're saying, about vaccine hesitancy in Africa.
And you and I talked about this point specifically, that when they would transition to, you know, your state, your county, your country needing herd immunity to suddenly being, well, that guy over there in the corner of Africa is not vaccinated yet, therefore we're all still at risk. It's the same argument they make about war, right? No one's safe until we're all safe. You know, terrorism's got to be defeated. It's the same endless, never reachable argument.
Yeah, well, I really recommend people interested in this issue listen to my podcast with Jeremy once it comes out, because he had a lot of good information about how there's very prominent, powerful people in the U.S. framing Africa's vaccine hesitancy as a national security threat to the U.S. Anyway,
and this is where it becomes and this again, another point that you and I talked about in 2020. When will we see the vaccine wars? Right? When are we going to see the virus wars, where it's because, oh well, their very presence is putting us at risk because of vaccines, unvaccination, or just the threat of the virus? We called this. I mean, at least we theorized this would come, and that's a very scary prospect to think about.
Yeah. Anyway, beyond this, in this Political article, they pretty much start with a quote from the head of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. For people, which is one of the main groups behind COVAX, which is supposedly solving the vaccine inequity problem in Africa. Yeah. And
that's Pfizer, right? COVAX?
No. COVAX is the Vaccine Equity Initiative, which is co-led by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which was launched with money from Bill and Melinda Gates. Yeah,
I'm confusing it with one of the other vaccine names. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So basically, what people need to keep in mind about Gavi, they frame themselves as a non-profit related to getting vaccines where they need to go. Okay, if you look on their website, they make it very explicit that their mission is to promote the health of vaccine markets. Healthy markets. And if you look at their page, it's very clear that's what this is about. So they want to establish the never-ending COVID-19 vaccine boosters every 3 to 6 months, forever and ever gravy train in Africa, because that's what their mission is to make markets for vaccines, healthy markets for vaccines. Bill and Melinda Gates. If you look, really Bill Gates, if you look at the way he talks about his investments, his quote unquote philanthropy, he describes them as investments. His philanthropic donations are investments. And
with Bill Gates, a lot to talk about what he's been working on. And Mr. Gates, thank you so much for being with us. I'd like to talk to you about your approach to vaccinations. You wrote something recently, and like you always do, you kind of looked at the problem from a scientific and business perspective on things. You've invested $10 billion in vaccinations over the last 2 decades, and you figured out the return on investment for that, and it kind of stunned me. Can you walk us through the math?
Well, it's pretty impressive that when you take these vaccines, get them to be very inexpensive by making big volume commitments, have that right relationship with the private sector, get the delivery system so they're really getting the coverage out there, you literally save millions of lives. And 20 years ago, when we created these new multilateral organizations, Gavi for the vaccines, Global Fund for HIV, TB and malaria, we didn't know they'd be successful. They've gone through lots of challenges about making sure the money gets there, making sure the efficiency is right. But as we look at upcoming replenishments for those, and we've got so much distraction politically that the international needs like this could get eclipsed if we're not careful. We see a phenomenal track record. It's been $100 billion overall that the world's put in. Our foundation is a bit more than $10 billion, but we feel there's been over a 20-to-1 return. So if you just look at the economic benefits, that's a pretty strong number compared to anything else. The human benefit in millions of lives saved. So, we're here with a pretty strong message that although all these other issues are very important, let's not forget about the great success in global health and maintaining that commitment.
I think the numbers that you ran through were, if you had put that money into an S&P 500 and reinvested the dividends, you'd come up with something like $17 billion, but you think it's $200 billion.
Here, yeah. You know, helping young children live, get the right nutrition, contribute to their countries, that has a payback that goes beyond any typical financial return.
Right. Scott Gottlieb, the FDA commissioner.
And he is on record saying the return on investment you get from vaccine philanthropy is unlike any other thing he invests in, and it's a huge payout. So anyway, just wanted to emphasize that there. Let's see. And then we have ABC News, Omicron brings vaccine inequity home to roost, but you know, they've been forced to admit, as I mentioned earlier, this is now about vaccine hesitancy, and that basically, you know, the variants will keep coming unless everyone takes the vaccine, right? So
right. The threat that they're framing this as, and I've made this point many times, the threat is no longer that this is actually a risk. The threat is the hesitancy itself, right? They're not framing that the hesitancy leads to some verifiable risk we can verify, or that we can, you know, show you with metrics, but rather that the hesitancy is the threat. Just like the unvaccinated now is therefore the threat. Not that they could be sick and be a threat, but being unvaccinated is a direct threat. Like, they've very quickly made that transition, and there's no logic to that.
Yeah, so the thing is, not only have they shifted now, oh, we just have to send vaccines to Africa because it's a vaccine inequity issue, right, because it's now a vaccine hesitancy issue. There's also been a shift here. So this piece is from Catherine Aben in Vanity Fair, who was recently on Democracy Now! Mm-hmm. And she says, the problem is shifting from not enough doses to not enough support on the ground to administer doses. Okay.
So people saying no, essentially, is what they keep framing as, like, we'll just come back and ask them again tomorrow.
Yeah, well, she wrote the article she's talking about in that interview is this one from Vanity Fair about the $2.5 billion plan to thwart future variants by getting everyone vaccinated around the world, right?
Right, exactly the point. Exactly.
Yeah,
and again, using the idea that Omicron is the threat. Right? I mean, as they know it's not.
Right. But here's some stuff I want to call attention to in here. So it's going away from vaccine equity to improving what she calls vaccination readiness, which is the absorbing and administering of the donated vaccines. Okay. To tackle this problem, USAID, the CIA cutout, is implementing a plan that was designed by Boston Consulting Group. Okay. And this is so insane. And it's about deploying rapid response teams for Africa. There's a need for a boots on the ground effort, similar to what has been required within the United States, i.e. the involvement of the U.S. military, but not in the U.S., right. In Africa.
This is the beginning. This is the beginning of vaccine regime change. This is. I keep saying this, Whitney. As you coined, your body is the new battlefield. This is the beginning of that agenda that they're using the vaccine, the inequity, the hesitancy, the threat from unvaccinated to begin to create foreign policy. That scares the hell out of me. I mean, this.
Oh, it gets worse, dude. You should really listen to this podcast I have with Jeremy, because a lot of the stuff he brought to the table is just unreal. But they're going to say it's pretty clear they're sending the military into Africa. To vaccinate people there. But anyway,
I've never hated being right about something more in my life during this COVID-19 topic. These are things that anybody who's paying attention could have seen coming, and it's just we tried to warn people. We should.
Well, yeah. Well, here's the other thing about Omicron too. We don't even know if it actually originated in Africa.
Exactly,
because it was detected before it was reported by South Africa and Europe.
Well, but I also ask whether it's even real. Like, whether that is just another way to make it seem like it's been endemic, and now we need to get ahead of it because it's already been here. And I haven't seen any indication that any of these things are actually not just the vaccine causing more problems. But I agree with you. They're using waste samples, which is another point you made a while back about Pittsburgh and the, I think it was Pittsburgh, and the medical pre-crime, essentially. Yeah, using the wastewater and sampling that, and how they were already building out infrastructure underneath you to do that. I mean, and now we're seeing that come to fruition. Oh, look, we found Omicron in the waste samples in Denver. Was it Denver? I don't know. It was multiple places I saw already that said that.
Right, but really quick back to this. They're claiming, the Biden administration's claiming that all of this is pre-decisional. It's a working document. So I to be fair, I'll mention that. But beyond that, the plan talks about the ongoing need to turn vaccines into vaccinations. Oh, that's from a separate plan from the White House about new actions to protect against Omicron. And turning vaccines into vaccinations is the new focus.
Yeah,
that
is the tagline I keep hearing.
Yeah. And so now that they are, the vaccine inequity thing is a non-issue. It's about aggressive investment in vaccination readiness, which, if you recall up here, vaccination readiness is absorbing and administering vaccines. And the plan here, courtesy of CIA cutouts and Boston Consulting Group, is boots on the ground effort. And they make it pretty explicit who will be the boots on the ground teams. Down here, USAID, the CDC, and the Defense Department.
Wow.
Right? So, supposed anti-imperialist people in independent media who just want all the Africans to be vaccinated. Do you know what's better for the African people than Africans themselves?
Right.
Is their free will a threat to your safety? I know they'll make that argument about people in their own countries domestically, but are you willing to say that about brown people now and still call yourself anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist? I think it's time to relook, take another look at the evidence and maybe reevaluate what's going on here, because if you're going to follow the new shift in the vaccine inequity argument you've been promoting to what it's become now, you're promoting CIA cutouts and the U.S. military going into Africa to turn vaccines into vaccinations among a population that doesn't want to get vaccinated.
Yeah, it's an inherently hypocritical stance. I mean, it's like anti-fascist, Antifa going out there and screaming against fascism while they're conducting fascist tactics. I mean, it's the same kind of thing. And whether they realize it or not, I actually think a lot of them are just don't really believe in the concepts they do. It's politically advantageous to them, like a lot of stuff is today. But that's a great point to lay out for people, that whether, like,
can you tell me, if we step back to, let's say, February of 2020, how dangerous a disease is COVID? And then the same question for the present day to a doctor like you who has experience and all the tools necessary at their disposal.
For an infection, there probably is no other infection that we now understand is so amenable to risk stratification. How can the same viral infection be fatal in an octogenarian and have it be less than a common cold in a kindergarten-aged child? The principle of that's called risk stratification. It's actually probably due to the density of ACE2 receptors in the human body. The virus actually gains entry into the human body through the ACE2 receptor and to a lesser extent the TMPRSS2 receptor. It turns out that we have a lesser density of ACE2 receptors in older individuals, those who are smokers and diseased. But the virus doesn't, the number of receptors doesn't matter in terms of entry, but the number of receptors that actually exist, since they're destroyed by the entry, the sheer number provides protection against basically a catastrophe in the lungs, what's called the respiratory distress syndrome. We also know that the proclivity for blood clotting increases over time. There's thousands of determinants of coagulation. And the very unique thing about this virus is that the mode of death is micro blood clots that occur throughout the body, the lungs, and there are fatal thromboembolic consequences. Almost every autopsy I'm aware of, Brett, has shown the lungs are filled with blood clots at the time of death. So it's the idea that risk stratification is so huge, and so it can be very deadly in an octogenarian and is completely benign in a school-aged children. That risk stratification must be applied with every single inference we make in the pandemic.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it is obviously at odds with a public health response that seems to be one size fits all, almost to a cartoonish degree. The idea that vaccines are inherently the right response, that the fact that these vaccines are incredibly novel at a technological level. They are a marvel, but they are novel. And the idea that we should be interested in immediately vaccinating the entire world if we can reach them with these novel technologies, effectively dragging the entire human species into what I would call an irresponsibly uncontrolled experiment, seems preposterous. I mean, as you point out, very young, healthy children are effectively at zero risk from COVID. Is that a fair statement?
It's a fair statement. We've looked at, obviously, we're at now in the last 2 meetings with the FDA on the pediatric and adolescent vaccination, September and October of 2021. There's a general recognition through May that 40% of children have already had COVID-19. That's through May. That's before the Delta outbreak. The Delta outbreak was huge in the United States. You know, it was 2/3 of the peak of our pre-vaccination peak. And we know there it actually seemed to prey upon the young. And so my estimate would be, I would put a number on it, 80% of children now that are in the discussion for vaccination have already had COVID. And now the CDC in the last week has acknowledged that they don't have a single case of someone who has recovered from COVID, getting it a second time and passing to anyone. So it's basically over with. We have now, the CDC estimates are generally for the United States, 148 million Americans through May are immune, that they actually have had COVID-19 and they have natural immunity. That's now supported by over 120 studies. That's being, by the way, accumulated on the Brownstone Institute website, 120 studies supporting natural immunity. It's a one and done phenomenon. The only confusion that exists out there is a second positive test that can happen as a false positive test, and some early confusion on the original CDC assay not being able to distinguish between flu and COVID-19. But in terms of scientific reality, one only gets COVID-19 infection once. The immunity is robust, complete, and durable, just like SARS-CoV-1. They're 90% similar as the virus. That natural immunity is going to carry us. And you're right, the public health response has not been along the lines of risk stratification as it is with other vaccines. You know, we don't carpet bomb the entire population for the meningococcal vaccine. It's kids who go to college and live in dormitories get the meningococcal vaccine. Americans don't have a problem with that because it's safe and effective and it's appropriately risk stratified. The same thing with the pneumococcal vaccine. We give the pneumococcal vaccine to seniors because they're at risk for pneumococcal pneumonia. We don't give it to children because they're not at risk. The same risk stratification principles for other vaccines should have always been applied to the COVID-19 vaccines.
Yes, it looks to me, and of course, I'm a scientist, not a medical doctor, but it looks to me like every normal medical standard and convention has been thrown out, that effectively the standard of care is not based on the kind of scientific deliberation that you would imagine would have to be at the foundation, that the right to informed consent is nowhere in evidence, and that we are effectively, well, if this was a scientific question rather than a medical question, I would say something has started with the conclusion and worked backwards, which is the greatest scientific sin that there is. And in this case, it has the added horror of putting human health and well-being in jeopardy. And I'm not sure, the problem is that what I've just said seems to me quite uncontroversial, actually, just the simple facts of what we are doing, the idea that anybody would think to vaccinate children who are safe from this disease with a vaccine, even if we did not have any evidence of harm, which is not the case with these vaccines. The idea that anybody would vaccinate people who are at no risk, who have a long life ahead of them, many of whom have already had a disease that provides robust immunity, the idea that we would expose them to any risk at all from vaccines that are so new is preposterous. And yet, when I look at the explanation for why we're doing that, it's in vague, almost childish terms, right? The idea is somehow that vaccines are good and that you are doing something for your child by by inoculating them without anything that looks like an adult risk-benefit analysis. So what has happened such that the interface between the public and medicine is now looks like more like PR and customer service than it does like science and medicine?
One of the most flagrant examples of what you just mentioned was recently CNN medical correspondent Sanjay Gupta appeared on Sesame Street and was with another CNN correspondent effectively seducing children into taking the COVID-19 vaccine without presenting a fair balance between the potential benefits and risks of the medical product. You know, we have laws in place. We have pharmaceutical that Americans get a fair balance of benefits and risks. And you're right, that's been abrogated in this case. There's been a giant abrogation of medical ethics, of pharmaceutical pharmacovigilance and regulatory principles. And it's extraordinarily dangerous. I think historians will write about this for years to come. How did America go off the rails? I recently had dinner with Scott Atlas. We spoke at a symposium together, and Scott used that term over and over again. He said, things are off the rails. We're not following any of the general rules. Well, what could have been different? That was your question, Brett. What could have been different? What could have been and should have been different is teams of doctors. We should have had teams of qualified doctors working along 4 principles, and I presented this to America when I testified in the U.S. Senate in November of 2020. I said, listen, we should have had a team that was totally focused on reducing spread of the illness. Great. A separate team focused on early treatment, yet another team focused on in-hospital treatment, and then a final team focused on vaccination. Those teams should have been gathered. They could have met virtually, and they should have given at least weekly or monthly reports with evidence reviews and scientific updates. You know, we're not having any formal evidence reviews and scientific updates in the 4 important areas called the 4 pillars of pandemic response. I ultimately published that. Well, I can tell you, if we had the right committee structure in place, and for vaccines, we obviously should have had a data safety monitoring board, a critical event committee, and a human ethics board. I think that the mortality signal emerged on the vaccines January 22nd, where we had 182 deaths. The eyeball estimate was 150 deaths total for a giant vaccine program. We know that's the number for all the vaccines combined in the United States, 278 million shots. We were already had a mortality signal January 22nd. I think a data safety monitoring board, and look at this, and I chair data safety monitoring boards for the NIH, big pharma, in vitro diagnostics. I've done this a dozen or so times, actually a couple dozen times. I know what I'm talking about. I've shut down with my committees big pharma programs. I mean, huge pharma programs. Our vaccine program would have been shut down in February for excess mortality. In America, this would have been very similar to the swine flu vaccine in 1976. It would have been, listen, sorry, this generation of vaccines didn't work out. Let's do a deep dive. We probably would have found that there were susceptible people. We now know that it's the seniors who die with the vaccine. Analyses from Rose and McLachlan have shown 50% of these deaths occur within 48 hours, 80% within a week. There's nursing home studies from Europe and Scandinavia that show when they actually review the charts in the seniors, at least 40%, the doctors have concluded, are directly due to the vaccines. The vignettes are severe reactions, fever, chills, nausea, vomiting, blood pressure dropping, and then death within a day or two, whether it's basically a cardiopulmonary collapse due to overwhelming production of the spike protein, or a thromboembolic death or a bleeding death a few weeks later. But they are clearly biologically related to the vaccines. Now we're seeing actually in obituaries. There's an obituary from Washington State, a young woman, where in her obituary it states that she died of vaccine-induced thrombocytopenic purpura. There's actually now new vaccine deaths. Choi and colleagues published a death of a myocarditis death in a 22-year-old Korean young man who took the vaccine. And, these are young people dying, and now their obituaries and their case reports are basically describing the vaccine-induced fatal illness. Our tolerance, by the way, for new biologic or medicinal products and death is about 5 cases gets a black box warning, 50 cases, it's off the market. Doesn't matter if it's causally related or not. It's off the market, and then a deep dive in terms of safety? What went wrong? There's no assumption of causality. And on 3 occasions now, we've seen the CDC put on their website that they've reviewed the deaths and they just summarily dismiss them as none of them being caused by the vaccines. And I can tell you, scientists in my circle don't buy that at all.
So incredibly troubling story. Can't say didn't tell you so, because we did here at Breaking Points. But the new CEO of Twitter has greenlit a new regime of policies, which we outlined previously, how they're going to destroy journalism on, the so-called privacy policy of not being able to post, pictures of so-called private people without their consent, despite the fact that a huge amount of Twitter activism, journalism, and past events like George Floyd, Philando Castile, Kyle Rittenhouse, and so much more were decided based on social media posting. Well, now has come a regime of actually blocking what they claim are anonymous bot accounts, which are causing harm, but once again, very telling about which exact ones are getting blocked. And 2 of them yesterday were nuked at the very same time, which just goes to show you that this is a protection regime of the elites and of powerful. Let's put this first one up there on the screen. The Nancy Pelosi portfolio tracker, after amassing more than 200,000 followers on Twitter, was nuked. Now that's really interesting, isn't it, Crystal? Because that portfolio tracker was just doing one thing. They were posting trades that the Pelosi family was publicly disclosing via the Stock Act. That's it. There was no false information, as far as I could tell, that had been posted in the past. There hasn't been necessarily any warnings. There hasn't been any clear iteration of what the violation of the rules. It was simply exposing the fact that this woman, the Speaker of the House, and her husband and family routinely engage in extraordinarily sketchy, but yes, legal stock trades. So much so that many teenagers on Twitter had been taken, teenagers on TikTok had taken to following her trades and just making those, repeating them blind, and actually doing quite well in the stock market.
Interesting.
Great.
Isn't that interesting?
Democratization of information. That's what the entire internet was supposed to be about. Boom. It was completely and totally nuked. And then the second one, I want your reaction to this, Crystal, because this is the best one. Okay, let's put it up there. In the midst of one of the biggest days in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, well, the Tracker Trial account was suspended once again, amassing over 525,000 followers on Twitter. All they did was tweet pictures and updates from the trial. And they also, right before they got nuked, happened to tweet about how some images and past evidence presented at the trial seemed to indicate that the FBI was aware of Mr. Epstein's problems long before they went ahead and charged him in 2019. Miraculously, the account was nuked an hour later.
Whoa.
Really interesting.
I didn't know that was among
came
the
out
last
yesterday.
Wow. I mean, listen, I can't say I followed every single tweet of the Nancy Pelosi portfolio tracker or the Ghislaine Maxwell trial tracker, but this is insane. I mean,
it's crazy.
This is totally crazy. I would love to know what their pretend justification is here. It's hard to see it outside of the context of this new CEO who said, that we're not going to be bound by the First Amendment. Here it is in action right now. And that the question, that he was going to be much more in favor of censoring and picking and choosing who got to say what on the platform. And, this seems like early evidence that he meant what he said.
No, he not only did he mean what he said, he greenlit this terrible policy. Let's put this up there, their tweet, their justification. Someone has to sort out the bots on Twitter, and we've got a team on it. We've launched a label for the good ones, and while the label is an endorsement, we want you to know which bots are developers to help, entertain, or just harmlessly share info. The ones that they're cleaning out, what they claim are bot activity, but are certainly not, or if they are just, these are accounts and algorithms or whatever that are just built in order to aggregate information. And it just gets to the core of the product. This was supposed to be democratization of information. At the very beginning, the Twitter CEO called himself the free speech wing of the free speech party. And that was great while the revolutions were happening in other countries. Whenever it came to challenging power here in the US, it's just all about protecting those who are in power. And, I just don't know how to get away from the fact that it just seems like every single time The account that gets nuked are the ones that happen to challenge those who are at the very highest echelons of power, and the ones that get to stay up are like fighting misinformation or something like, here's exposing Russian bots or
Listen, they better
DNC
take down every
tracker.
K-Hive bot
Yeah,
account
yeah,
if they're
please,
going in this direction. But that's the problem, is we know they
Yeah,
won't.
they will never do
We know
that.
they won't.
Yeah.
And that's, the language of that was actually really disturbing to me too. Like, we're gonna tell you what the good ones are.
Yeah.
It's like, wait a second,
why?
who are you to be the judge and jury on this? You're
the trial here. So I've been saying since last year that this is about creating a spectacle, and that suggests to, I don't know, I guess the vast majority of the public, the impressionable public, that Ghislaine Maxwell had her day in front of court, and, you know, it was fair trial, justice was done. The government did something. They did, so they can try and get around the you guys covered this up argument. And, you know, one of the reasons I pointed that out last year is because if you read the indictment about the trial that's currently ongoing, there's a lot of stuff they say in there that were crimes she was not charged for, like admitting that she was directly involved in sexual assaults of the women testifying, and not really being held to account for that. But I think a lot of people that have even been following this trial more or less superficially, at least in your audience, not talking about necessarily the broader public, are aware that, you know, sort of like there's the fix is more or less in here. And I want to explain why that is. So if you're familiar with my Epstein, the work on the case in general, I don't really talk so much about the legal cases that have been ongoing. That's not really my area of expertise, right? I focus more on the historical context, how someone like Epstein was able to operate, who he was most likely working for, and, you know, sort of the institutional corruption within the government as well that allowed him to continue doing that. So when you look at that, it's pretty clear that institutions like the FBI, for example, that Annie Farmer, Maria Farmer reported Epstein and Ghislaine for what Maxwell's on trial now for back to the FBI in 1996, and they did nothing, and they still won't release even a redacted version of the original report that she submitted. Her sister is set to testify, I guess today. She was going to testify yesterday, and then all of a sudden one of Ghislaine Maxwell's attorneys falls suddenly ill, and it gets moved to another day. So we'll see if something weird doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Again,
I find that very strange, just the timing of it all. I mean, I think they almost, even if it is actually what happened, I think they want us to jump in and be like, he was poisoned, or hypothetically jump into it. But, you know, these things are possible, and we've seen.
Yeah, but really quick, pursuant to my point, that is just one example of like FBI complicity here. And ultimately, what's going to happen is that if this case was actually being pursued by the government in a way that was honest and aimed at getting justice for victims and preventing this from happening again, there would be a serious discussion about blackmail and how the government enabled this, how Epstein was an FBI, documented anyway, to have been an FBI informant. The FBI ran cover for this. Co-conspirators in this case, like Alan Dershowitz, for example, hired ex-FBI directors like Louis Freeh to go and intimidate victims. Things like that, and it's that's just the FBI, right? And so basically, what you have in this trial, a lot of people have pointed out, is that one of the main prosecuting attorneys or attorneys on the prosecution is the daughter of James Comey, ex-director of the FBI. You have a judge who is very cozy, apparently, with Alan Dershowitz, calling him a luminary and a legal and Talmudic scholar, and how he's just so brilliant. Right, and then you have the defense attorneys, and one of her defense attorneys previously represented Epstein's cellmate, who was the last person to see him alive, right, supposedly, and had that weird cell phone that he somehow got that he shouldn't have had, and yeah, so basically what you have is a setup there where all sides are essentially at least controlled to some extent. They can control what comes out and what is covered in that courtroom and what is not. And I think back in March, there was actually a ruling from this judge about this particular case that some numerous details could not be made public because they were deemed too impure.
I had to make sure that wasn't the Babylon Bee or something. Like, how is that even possible that she's making like it's too distasteful for the American public? Like, that has no bearing on what's true and what, you know what I mean? Like, that's a personal choice. It's subjective.
Yeah, I mean, given the state of like American media and stuff like the Inquirer and whatever, and you're being like, it's too salacious when that stuff is like at checkout counters in grocery stores all over the country. It's like, it's a hard argument to believe, but it's obviously, there's something else going on there. And if you look at the other judges that have, handled cases involving Maxwell in the past, I think her last name is Preska, the one that handled the one with Virginia Roberts and Ghislaine Maxwell. She's the one that sent Stephen Donziger, the Chevron attorney, to prison and was basically bought out by powerful interest. So, that's sort of telling. Another thing, too, is if you listen to testimony from Epstein victims or people familiar, very directly familiar with the situation in terms of like personal experience, a lot of them refer to Epstein as having been sort of like middle management. It's hard to make that same argument for someone from the Maxwell family, particularly the favorite daughter of Robert Maxwell, because that family is, even after Robert Maxwell died in 1991, that family's spied up, especially the sisters, including Isabel Maxwell, who I've written about pretty extensively, has a lot of those Bill Gates ties to Epstein originally through a business that both her twin sister Christine and also Ghislaine were directly involved with throughout the 1990s. And basically why the sex trafficking operation was going on in the 90s, Ghislaine's cover story was, "I'm an internet operator," talking about the specific company that had all these ties with Microsoft. Jeffrey Epstein was flying around on planes with the chief technology officer at the time of Microsoft and attending Microsoft Russia conferences and all of this stuff before he and Gates supposedly ever knew each other. There's some weird stuff going on here, but I do want to stress that there's considerable evidence, and I don't know if I would have time to get all of this out in writing before a baby comes because I was going to do a 2-part article on Ghislaine because of the trial, and I have the first part done. But basically, Robert Maxwell, described by his biographers as Israel's super spy, intimately involved with the same political faction, I guess you could argue, within the United States, but it's a transnational faction. Or supranational, that is responsible for things like Promise and Iran-Contra, which is also the same crowd as the continuity of government stuff, subsequent ties in later decades to September 11th, 2001, lots of other crazy scandalous stuff that has happened over the past, 30, 40 years or so. Robert Maxwell was very intimately involved with that. And by all indications, Epstein was recruited into that circle by Maxwell, and that predated slightly his involvement with Wexner. But there's a lot of other moving parts here. There's sort of like the intelligence stuff and the financial Wall Street stuff, which are technically separate, but they do intersect and relate. But anyway, Robert Maxwell was like not a small dude. I mean, even though because of his death, having been related to a lot of the people that he actually previously worked for, he had become a liability, but he was also then given a state funeral, by Israeli intelligence, right? So he, in his family, openly admit, if you read some of my old articles on this called the Maxwell Family Business, on my website, for example, that they were all about, as soon as he died, rebuilding the family legacy through tech companies and other things. But Ghislaine had a very special role that was different. And actually, as soon as he was found dead, out of all of the children, it was Ghislaine. And this was observed by a British journalist who refuses to recant the story, even decades after the fact, that he accompanied the Robert Maxwell's wife and Ghislaine Maxwell to the yacht, and it was Ghislaine who went and found all the went and pulled out specific documents from different folders, things like that, and shredded them all. She knew exactly what to get rid of, and that out of it being the kid that knows where, you know, all the secrets are hidden, all the bodies are buried, implies that back then in 1991, she was intimately aware of what her father was involved with. And then from there on gets involved in a sex trafficking operation. None of this has been mentioned in the trial, the espionage links and all of that. And that is very unsettling in the context that there had been testimony and pictures shown of basically the blackmail itself, stored digitally with names of people attached to CDs and different folders and all of that stuff, but the names being entirely redacted, so we don't know who it was. But the prosecution didn't bring up any sort of mention of blackmail. They're trying to argue, of course, that Maxwell was the partner in crime of Epstein, but a lot of their evidence towards that is very heavily focused on Epstein, not on Maxwell, who's on trial. And it's also stuff like, look at this picture of her massaging his feet. She massaged the criminal's feet. Enabler. That is like such a weak argument. I mean, sorry to laugh, but it's just like, you know, I could have made something better for them.
It feels
super pregnant.
It's an insult to those that are, you know, like yourself, that have been following the story. This is what I keep hearing a lot of the.
It's not even me. It's an insult to victims. This is just a total farce. And the prosecution should be really ashamed of themselves. But they're there for a purpose. This is to control the flow, like we were saying a second ago, of what information comes out and what doesn't. And once this trial happens, they can file a bunch of this stuff that's floating around in evidence, whether it's shown in court or not, under seal, and then it never comes out, right? So I think that's one of the main motives here that's not being talked about.
Which is like